Ringo Starr's. What if the least talented guy in the room turned out to be the only reason the whole thing didn't fall apart? That's not a trick question. That's the actual story of a drummer who spent years being told he was replaceable, got literally recorded over on one of his own band's first hits, and somehow ended up being the last man still touring at 85 years old, while the band that made him famous has been over for more than half a century. Stick with me, because this one's got hospital beds, boats to nowhere, 16 bottles of wine a day, and a comeback nobody saw coming. Ringo Starr. Let's start where most people think the story starts. Except it doesn't. Everyone remembers him as the Beatle with the rings on his fingers and the goofy grin behind the drum kit. Funny Ringo. Lucky Ringo. The guy who got picked last for talent, but somehow ended up in the most famous band on earth. That's the myth. The truth is a lot heavier, and honestly, a lot more impressive. Rewind all the way back to July 1940. A baby boy named Richard Starkey is born in a cramped little house in one of the poorest, roughest corners of Liverpool, right in the middle of World War II, with bombs falling on the city around him. His dad walks out on the family when Richard's only 3 years old, leaving his mum to work herself to the bone just to keep food on the table. Rough start. It gets rougher. At 6 years old, Richard's appendix ruptures, and he ends up fighting for his life, with peritonitis, a nasty, dangerous infection. He slips into a coma for days. Doctors aren't even sure he's going to make it. He survives, but he spends an entire year stuck in a children's hospital recovering, and by the time he gets back to school, he's fallen so far behind he can barely read. Elsie Starkey. His mother refuses to let him get lost in the system. She scrapes together what little she has and finds him a neighbor willing to help tutor him back up to speed. Slowly, painfully, he catches up. And then, because the universe apparently wasn't done testing this kid, tuberculosis sweeps through Britain, and 13-year-old Richard gets hit with it too. This time, it's not a year in the hospital, it's 2, locked away in a sanatorium, cut off from his friends, his school, basically his whole childhood. Now here's the twist. In that sanatorium, bored out of his mind, and stuck in a hospital bed, nurses hand out instruments to keep the kids occupied. Richard picks up a pair of drumsticks and starts tapping on the wooden cabinet next to his bed. That's it. That's the moment. A sick kid drumming on furniture, because there's nothing else to do, ends up falling completely in love with rhythm. He'd later describe music as something that basically saved his life during those lonely years. And if you think about it, that checks out, because rhythm was the one thing in his life he could actually control. He gets out, gets a factory job, saves up, buys his first real drum kit, and starts playing in local skiffle bands around Liverpool. By 1959, he's landed a spot with Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, one of the biggest local acts in town. And that's where Richard Starkey disappears and Ringo Starr is born. Ringo for the rings he wore on every finger, Starr for the flashy drum solos the band nicknamed Star Time. So here's a guy who spent half his childhood in hospital beds, basically taught himself rhythm out of boredom and survival instinct, and built a name for himself from nothing. Sounds like the setup for a triumphant entrance into the Beatles, right? Wrong. It was almost the opposite. John Lennon. In August 1962, John Lennon makes the call to bring Ringo in to replace their old drummer Pete Best. Right as the band is about to break big. You'd think Ringo would walk into a hero's welcome. Instead, he walks into a wall of boos. His very first gig with the group, fans loyal to Pete Best hold up signs and chant against him. Just days into the job, and he's already public enemy #1 to half the fan base. Then it gets worse. When they go into the studio to record Love Me Do, producer George Martin isn't convinced Ringo's got what it takes behind the kit, so he brings in a session drummer to play instead, and sticks Ringo on tambourine for the actual recording. Imagine that. You just joined the most important band of your life, and on the very first big session, they don't even trust you to play your own instrument. But here's where Ringo quietly turns the tables. He's left-handed, playing a drum kit built for right-handed players, and instead of that being a weakness, it gives his playing this slightly off-kilter, completely unique feel. You can hear it in tracks like Come Together, and A Day in the Life. Musicians and producers would spend decades trying to figure out exactly what made his timing so distinct. Turns out the guy nobody trusted at first was quietly building the backbone of the Beatles' sound. As Beatlemania exploded, though, something else was happening behind the scenes. While John, Paul, and George were locked into their own creative rivalries and ego battles, Ringo often found himself on the outside looking in. Respected, sure, but not always included in the big creative decisions. By 1968, during the tense sessions for the White Album, the tension in the room got so bad that Ringo actually quit the band. He packed up, got on a boat, and sailed off to Sardinia just to get away from all of it. And here's a sweet detail. Sitting on that boat, staring at the ocean, feeling done with the whole thing, he wrote Octopus's Garden, one of the gentlest, most peaceful songs the Beatles ever released. Funny how that works. When the other three realized the band genuinely didn't function without him, that he wasn't just filler, he was the glue, they sent him flowers and telegrams begging him to come back. When he finally walked back into the studio, his entire drum kit was covered in flowers. That's not a small gesture. That's 4 grown men essentially admitting they couldn't do this without him. He kept playing peacemaker, right up until the very end, trying to smooth things over between Paul and George during the tense Let It Be sessions in 1969. But by 1970, the band was done, and Ringo, the guy who'd spent years holding everyone else together, was left to figure out how to hold himself together. And for a while, he really struggled. His 1973 solo album Ringo was a massive hit, weirdly reuniting all 4 ex-Beatles on one record and giving him genuine solo success. He fell in love with actress Barbara Bach on a film set in 1980, and they married the following year. But that same period brought devastation. On December 8, 1980, John Lennon was murdered in New York, and Ringo was reportedly one of the first people to rush to Yoko Ono's side afterward. The loss hit him incredibly hard. Over the following years, by his own later admission, Ringo spiraled into heavy drinking and substance abuse, reportedly consuming shocking amounts of alcohol just to numb out. He's spoken candidly since about how destructive that period was for his marriage and his health, including behavior he deeply regrets and has publicly taken accountability for. It got dark enough that people around him genuinely worried he might not come out the other side. In 1988, he and Barbara checked into rehab together, a joint decision to save both his life and his marriage. He got sober, gave up cigarettes, switched to a plant-based diet, and basically rebuilt himself from the ground up. And that rebuild is what set the stage for the version of Ringo we know today. Instead of chasing chart numbers again, in 1989 he launched something completely different, a rotating supergroup called the All-Star Band, built around one simple idea. Everybody on stage gets to be a star. Legendary musicians from other iconic bands would join him on tour, each performing their own greatest hits, with Ringo holding it all together on drums. No pressure to compete for the #1 spot, just music, for the joy of it. In 2008, on his 68th birthday, he started something that's become a genuine little tradition, asking fans around the world to flash a peace sign at noon every July 7th, and just say, "Peace and love," out loud together. Simple, a little goofy, completely sincere, very on brand for the guy who once said his whole outlook was built on staying grateful. The honors piled up after that. Inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame a second time as a solo artist in 2015. Knighted by the British royal family in 2018. And when the pandemic shut the world down in 2020, instead of disappearing, he kept releasing music virtually, putting out upbeat EPs to keep people's spirits up when everything felt frozen. Which brings us to now, 2026, and this man is still going. Still touring with the All-Star Band. Still putting out new music, including a recent album made with veteran producer T-Bone Burnett. Still doing duets. Still, by all accounts, showing zero interest in slowing down, let alone stopping. And that brings us back to where we started. The idea that he was never chasing the title of best drummer in the world. In interviews, he's described his real role in the band a little differently. Not the most gifted musician in the room, but maybe the only one patient enough to survive being surrounded by that much talent, ego, and tension without cracking. Whether or not that was ever officially his job title, it's basically what kept the Beatles together as long as they lasted. So here's the actual lesson buried under all the hit songs and headlines. The loudest, flashiest person in the room isn't always the one holding everything up. Sometimes it's the quiet, steady one in the back. The guy nobody bet on. The guy who got told to sit this one out. The guy who just kept showing up. Ringo Starr spent his childhood fighting to survive hospital wards. Spent his 20s fighting to be taken seriously. Spent his 40s fighting his own demons. And somehow, he's the one still standing on stage in his 80s. That's not luck. That's just showing up, one more time than everybody expects you to. If this kind of story hits different for you, the underdog who turns out to be the backbone all along, give it a like, drop your thoughts below, and subscribe if you want more stories like this one. Peace and love, and we'll see you in the next one.